Throughout human history, periods of stability have often been interrupted by moments of profound disruption. Civilizations rise, adapt, and expand, only to encounter forces far beyond human control. Earth itself has never been a static backdrop. It is a dynamic system, shaped by oceans, atmosphere, magnetic fields, and cycles that unfold over spans far longer than any single lifetime. In recent years, many people have begun to notice something unsettling. Extreme weather events no longer feel isolated. Storms appear stronger, more frequent, and less predictable. Floods occur in regions once considered stable. Heat waves, cold snaps, droughts, and violent winds seem to arrive in rapid succession, sometimes overlapping rather than replacing one another. These observations are not limited to one country or one climate zone. They are global. From coastal regions battered by hurricanes, to inland areas facing unprecedented rainfall, to polar regions experiencing rapid ice loss, the planet appears to be under growing stress. For most people, the first instinct is to look for explanations that feel familiar. Climate variability, natural cycles, and human impact are often cited, and understandably so. Earth's climate has always fluctuated, and industrial activity has undeniably altered atmospheric conditions. These explanations offer a framework that feels grounded and manageable, yet, for many, something still feels incomplete. When systems begin to shift simultaneously, oceans, skies, ice, and wind, it raises questions that go beyond any single cause. Are these events truly independent, or are they connected in ways we don't yet fully understand? This sense of unease isn't new. History shows that moments of widespread environmental instability have often preceded major transitions. Ancient societies recorded floods, prolonged storms, and sudden climate shifts in their myths, chronicles, and oral traditions. While the language differs, the patterns are strikingly consistent. Periods when the natural world appeared to behave differently, almost violently, forcing humanity to adapt or disappear. It's important to understand why these ideas resonate so strongly today. Public trust in institutions has not always been stable. Over time, declassified documents, revised timelines, and historical corrections have revealed that accepted narratives are sometimes incomplete and occasionally wrong. When information changes after decades of certainty, it leaves behind an understandable sense of doubt. People don't question official explanations out of curiosity alone. They question them because trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. This is why alternative theories gain traction, especially during times of visible instability. When storms intensify, when infrastructure strains, and when records are broken year after year, people naturally search for patterns. They ask whether what they are witnessing fits into a larger cycle. One that has occurred before, perhaps more than once. Preparedness adds another layer to this conversation. Governments plan for continuity. Wealthy individuals invest in resilience. Seed vaults, hardened infrastructure, and redundancy systems exist not because catastrophe is certain, but because uncertainty demands preparation. Risk management does not require belief, only the acknowledgement that low-probability, high-impact events are possible. At this stage, many viewers already feel a sense of agreement. The planet is changing. The systems that govern weather and climate are under strain. History is more complex than a single, linear timeline. And that leads to a deeper question. If Earth has experienced periods of widespread instability before, and if those events reshape civilizations, what would it look like if something similar were beginning again? That question doesn't require belief. It only requires curiosity. And before we explore how such events might unfold, it's worth pausing for a moment. What do you think you're observing right now? Is this simply a series of unrelated extremes? Or does it feel like part of a broader pattern? If you've thought about this before, consider how you interpret what's happening and why. Because the most important part of this discussion isn't what any single explanation claims. It's how confidently we can say we understand the full picture. When people talk about extreme weather today, the conversation usually stays focused on the immediate cause. A storm forms, a system intensifies, an event is labeled unprecedented, and then it passes. But for many observers, that explanation feels incomplete. Across cultures, across time, and across continents, there are repeated stories describing periods when weather itself became unstable, not in isolated regions, but globally. Flood myths appear in nearly every ancient civilization. Sudden climate shifts are recorded in ice cores, sediment layers, and abandoned settlements. Entire populations seem to vanish from the historical record, often at moments when environmental stress would have made survival extremely difficult. These patterns raise an uncomfortable question. Are extreme events simply random, or do they follow larger cycles that we only partially understand? For those who question mainstream narratives, skepticism doesn't usually begin with fantasy. It begins with broken trust. History, after all, is written by those who remain, and by those with the power to record it. Wars erase records. Regimes reshape timelines. Scientific consensus evolves, sometimes dramatically, as new evidence replaces old assumptions. Entire chapters of human development have been revised or quietly removed as discoveries forced uncomfortable reevaluations. So when people hear that Earth's climate has always been stable, or that civilization has only faced gradual change, many instinctively question that claim, not because they reject science, but because they know science itself is a process, not a finished product. Archaeology has uncovered cities buried beneath oceans. Geological layers show sudden disruptions that don't align neatly with slow, predictable models. Ancient calendars appear to track celestial cycles with surprising precision, as though earlier societies were deeply concerned with timing, with endings as much as beginnings. This is where curiosity turns into investigation. If extreme weather patterns once escalated rapidly, if storms intensified beyond regional boundaries, if climate shifts occurred faster than societies could adapt, then it's reasonable to ask whether similar conditions could ever return. What do you think? Do these ancient accounts feel symbolic? Or do they hint at real events filtered through the language of myth? Feel free to share your perspective in the comments. Because regardless of interpretation, one truth remains consistent. Civilizations are more fragile than they appear. Food systems depend on predictability. Infrastructure assumes stability. Modern society functions on the expectation that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. When that expectation fails, history shows how quickly order can unravel. And this brings us to a deeper, more unsettling idea. What if the stories of global storms, floods, and upheaval weren't warnings meant for the distant past, but records preserved because the cycle was expected to return? Before exploring that possibility, it's important to understand why these ideas persist and why they continue to resurface, even in an age of satellites, sensors, and advanced forecasting. Because belief isn't the driving force here. Pattern recognition is. And once a pattern is noticed, it becomes difficult to ignore. Once attention shifts from isolated disasters to broader patterns, a new line of questioning naturally emerges. Not about belief, but about scale. Modern media often frames extreme weather as localized crises. A storm here, a flood there, a heat wave somewhere else. Each event is treated as separate, unique, and contained. But history suggests a different possibility. There are periods where instability appears to spike globally, where environmental stress doesn't respect borders, seasons, or hemispheres. Ice cores reveal abrupt temperature shifts occurring within decades, not millennia. Ocean sediment layers show signs of rapid disruption. Tree rings record years of sudden drought, followed by catastrophic flooding. These aren't gradual trends, they're sharp breaks. And when those breaks occur, civilizations struggle. The archaeological record is filled with examples of advanced societies that collapsed without clear evidence of war or invasion. Cities abandoned, trade networks severed, agricultural systems failing almost simultaneously across large regions. In many cases, the only common factor appears to be environmental stress. This is where modern confidence often collides with ancient experience. We tend to assume our technology makes us immune, that satellites, models, and early warning systems would prevent large-scale surprise. But prediction does not equal control. Even today, storms strengthen faster than expected. Weather systems behave unpredictably. Records are broken year after year, sometimes quietly revised, sometimes explained away, sometimes simply accepted as the new normal. And when explanations change frequently, trust erodes. That erosion matters, because when people feel that official narratives minimize uncertainty or emphasize reassurance over transparency, they don't stop asking questions. They ask more. Why are certain risks emphasized while others are dismissed? Why do ancient accounts describe chaos on a global scale, while modern frameworks insist such events are nearly impossible? Why do so many cultures independently preserve stories of overwhelming storms, prolonged darkness, and sudden resets? These questions don't require conclusions. They only require honesty about what we don't fully understand. And that uncertainty opens the door to speculation, not because people want fear, but because they want coherence. What do you think drives that instinct? Is it misinformation or the absence of satisfying explanations? You can share your thoughts in the comments, because when trust fractures, curiosity fills the gap. And once curiosity takes hold, people begin connecting dots between ancient warnings, modern anomalies, and the quiet preparations happening in the background of the world's most powerful institutions: food reserves, seed vaults, hardened infrastructure, underground facilities, emergency protocols practiced far from public view. Each one can be explained individually, but taken together, they raise a simple question that many people quietly ask themselves. Are these just precautions for unlikely scenarios, or acknowledgments that certain possibilities cannot be ruled out? We're not there yet, but we're getting closer to the question that sits beneath all of this, the one that history, science, and human memory seem to orbit. And before we reach it, we need to understand what happens when patterns stop being theoretical and start becoming observable. At a certain point, pattern recognition stops being abstract. It becomes personal. Because once enough signals appear, once anomalies stack, once explanations feel incomplete, the question quietly changes. Not, has this happened before? But something far more unsettling. Could something like this happen again? And if so, would we recognize it while it was unfolding? History suggests that societies rarely identify turning points in real time. Most transitions are only named after they've passed. Once outcomes are known, once narratives can be stabilized. Those living through them often describe confusion instead of clarity. Warnings dismissed as exaggeration, contradictory information competing for attention, experts disagreeing publicly while reassuring privately. A sense that events are accelerating, but without a clear direction. Sound familiar? Consider how modern instability is framed. Each disruption is addressed individually. Each extreme event explained as unique. Each system failure treated as isolated. But what if that framing itself prevents recognition? What if large-scale disruption doesn't announce itself as a single dramatic moment, but as overlapping stresses that feel manageable until they aren't? This is where ancient accounts become uncomfortable, not because they predict the future, but because they describe the psychology of collapse. They speak of people continuing daily life while conditions deteriorate, of leaders maintaining order while systems strain, of warning signs ignored, not out of ignorance, but out of normalcy. Because normalcy is powerful. It tells us tomorrow will resemble today. It tells us preparation is unnecessary. It tells us that rare events stay rare, but history disagrees, and so does science. Abrupt climate shifts are not theoretical. They're documented. Rapid changes in ocean circulation, atmospheric composition, and solar interaction have occurred before. Sometimes, with little warning. The question is no longer whether Earth can change suddenly. It's whether we assume it won't. That assumption matters, because it shapes response. If disruption is believed to be impossible, early indicators are dismissed. If risk is framed as negligible, preparation feels excessive. And if trust in institutions is already strained, uncertainty multiplies. This is where many people find themselves today, not convinced of catastrophe, but uneasy about complacency. And that unease fuels a deeper curiosity. Why do governments maintain continuity of civilization plans? Why are extreme event scenarios quietly modeled while publicly downplayed? Why do financial systems hedge against instability even during periods labeled stable? These actions don't prove anything on their own, but they do suggest that possibility is taken seriously, at least behind closed doors. So here's the question worth asking, honestly and without drama. If early stages of large-scale disruption were beginning, would they look dramatic or deceptively familiar? What do you think? Is what we're seeing simply noise amplified by modern media? Or does it resemble the opening phase of patterns we only recognize in hindsight? You can share your perspective in the comments, because this isn't about fear, it's about awareness. And awareness is what allows us to examine the final piece of this discussion. The one grounded not in stories or speculation, but in measurable mechanisms. The science. Because if we're going to ask whether such events could happen again, we need to understand how they actually occur. To understand whether large-scale disruption is possible, we have to move away from narratives and toward mechanisms. Because Earth doesn't respond to belief systems. It responds to physics. One of the most important concepts in Earth science is equilibrium. The balance between incoming energy, outgoing energy, and the systems that distribute that energy across the planet. That balance is not fixed. It has shifted many times before. Temperature, atmospheric composition, ocean circulation, and solar input are all connected. Change one, and the others respond, sometimes gradually, sometimes abruptly. A key driver in past rapid shifts has been the oceans. The global ocean conveyor, the system of currents that move heat around the planet, plays a stabilizing role. Warm water moves poleward, cold water sinks and returns toward the equator. But this system is sensitive. Freshwater influx from melting ice can disrupt it. Rapid cooling can weaken it. Geological events can reroute it. And when circulation changes, climate patterns can shift dramatically in a matter of decades, or even years. This isn't speculative. Ice core data shows sudden temperature swings in Earth's past, not slow transitions, but sharp jumps. Entire regions have shifted from temperate to arid, from stable to storm-dominated, from predictable to chaotic. Another factor is atmospheric dynamics. The jet stream, a high-altitude river of air, helps regulate weather by separating warm and cold air masses. When temperature gradients weaken, the jet stream becomes unstable. It meanders, stalls, and amplifies weather extremes. This leads to longer heat waves, persistent storms, prolonged cold snaps, and unusual precipitation patterns. Again, not theory. Observation. Solar activity also plays a role, though not in the simplistic way it's often portrayed. Solar cycles influence atmospheric chemistry and upper atmosphere circulation. Changes in solar output don't need to be extreme to have cascading effects, especially when combined with other stressors. Earth systems don't fail from a single cause. They fail when multiple pressures align. That's the important point. Large disruptions aren't triggered by one dramatic event. They emerge from interaction. Ocean shifts combined with atmospheric instability, combined with solar variation, combined with geological stress. When thresholds are crossed, systems reorganize, and reorganization can look sudden from a human perspective. This is why the phrase unprecedented is often misleading. Events feel unprecedented because modern civilization has existed during an unusually stable climatic window. But stability is the exception, not the rule. So when scientists model extreme scenarios, they aren't predicting doom. They're mapping possibilities. They're asking, under what conditions does stability break? And how quickly can change propagate once it does? Those models consistently show one thing: non-linear response, gradual pressure, sudden outcome. Which brings us back to the central question: not whether catastrophe is inevitable, but whether complacency is justified. Because systems don't announce tipping points. They pass them. And only afterward does clarity arrive. So the real issue becomes awareness, not panic, not belief, but understanding how fragile balance can be when multiple forces converge. What do you think? Does knowing how these systems behave change how you interpret what's happening around us right now? Share your perspective below. Because the final part of this discussion brings everything together: history, psychology, and science into a single question. If disruption doesn't look like fiction, what does preparedness actually mean? When science is viewed in isolation, it can feel abstract. Charts, models, and probabilities don't always translate into lived experience. But when those mechanisms intersect with human systems, food, infrastructure, economies, and governance, the implications become much more tangible. Modern civilization is built on assumptions of stability. Supply chains assume predictable weather. Agriculture depends on seasonal reliability. Energy systems rely on steady demand and distribution. Even financial markets operate on the expectation that disruption will remain localized and temporary. When environmental systems behave outside those assumptions, pressure accumulates quickly. This doesn't require a dramatic collapse. It begins with delays, shortages, insurance withdrawals, infrastructure repairs that take longer than expected, emergency measures that quietly become routine. None of this looks like a disaster movie. It looks like adjustment. History shows that societies rarely fail all at once. They strain first. They adapt unevenly. Some regions stabilize while others struggle. Inequality widens. Resources are prioritized. And during these periods, perception matters as much as reality. If instability is framed as temporary, responses remain minimal. If it's framed as cyclical or structural, preparation increases. This helps explain a pattern many people notice but rarely discuss openly. Preparedness at the institutional level often advances quietly, without public emphasis. Strategic reserves expand. Continuity plans are revised. Emergency scenarios are modeled repeatedly, even as official messaging stresses normalcy. This doesn't imply secret knowledge. It reflects risk management. Organizations responsible for long-term continuity cannot afford optimism alone. They plan for unlikely outcomes precisely because the cost of being unprepared is so high. At the same time, public communication tends to prioritize reassurance, not because danger is imminent, but because panic carries its own risks. This tension between preparation and reassurance creates a gap, and gaps invite interpretation. This is where many people find themselves today, caught between observable instability and messages that encourage calm. Some interpret that gap as deception. Others see it as caution. Many simply feel uncertain, and uncertainty is uncomfortable, so people search for context. They revisit ancient accounts, they examine historical collapses, they analyze modern anomalies. They ask whether past disruptions share structural similarities with what's unfolding now. Not to predict the future, but to understand the present. What do you think? Does knowing how modern systems respond to stress change how you interpret the actions of governments, institutions, or even individuals preparing for uncertainty? Share your thoughts below, because the final stage of this discussion isn't about storms, oceans, or models alone. It's about perception, how humans recognize change, and how awareness, or the lack of it, shapes outcomes long before events reach a breaking point. At the center of every large-scale disruption is not just the environment, but human perception. How people interpret change often determines how they respond to it. History shows that warning signs are rarely ignored because they are invisible. They are ignored because they conflict with expectations. When change unfolds gradually or in unfamiliar ways, the mind works to normalize it. This is known as normalcy bias. It's the tendency to assume that tomorrow will resemble yesterday, even when evidence suggests otherwise. It keeps societies functioning during uncertainty, but it also delays recognition of systemic shifts. In past collapses, records describe populations continuing daily routines while conditions worsened. Trade persisted. Governance remained intact. Confidence endured, right up until thresholds were crossed. Those living through these moments didn't lack intelligence or information. They lacked perspective. From within a system, it's difficult to see the system itself changing. This is where perception becomes as important as data. When instability is framed as temporary, it encourages patience. When framed as rare, it discourages preparation. And when framed as impossible, it silences discussion entirely. Modern society relies heavily on expert interpretation, and for good reason. Scientific specialization allows deep understanding of complex systems, but specialization also fragments awareness. One group studies oceans, another studies atmosphere, another studies magnetics, another studies infrastructure. The challenge arises when interactions between these systems matter more than any single component. Large-scale disruption is rarely the result of one failure. It emerges from convergence. And convergence is difficult to communicate clearly without appearing speculative. So caution dominates messaging. Uncertainty is softened. Language is calibrated. Again, not to deceive, but to manage risk. Yet for those paying close attention, this creates a familiar tension. They notice signals that don't seem isolated. They observe preparations that aren't publicly emphasized. They recognize patterns that feel historically familiar. And they ask questions, not because they want fear, but because they want understanding. This is why conversations about cycles, resets, and convergence persist across generations. They resurface whenever stability feels less certain, not as predictions, as reflections. So here's the question worth considering at this stage. If awareness lags behind reality, and if recognition often comes too late, what role does attention play in shaping outcomes? What changes when individuals begin noticing patterns before institutions acknowledge them? And how much difference does perception make? See your hires, not in preventing disruption, but in navigating it. What do you think? Does awareness itself alter how societies respond to uncertainty? Share your perspective below. Because the final part of this discussion isn't about what will happen. It's about how humans respond when the familiar begins to shift, and whether recognizing that shift earlier changes anything at all. Throughout history, the most consequential changes are rarely announced. They don't arrive with certainty or clarity. They emerge quietly through accumulation, small shifts that seem manageable until they aren't. By the time patterns are undeniable, narratives have already formed. Explanations harden, responsibility diffuses, and hindsight replaces foresight. This doesn't mean disruption is inevitable, but it does mean that recognition is often delayed. Ancient accounts, scientific records, and modern preparedness strategies all point toward the same underlying truth. Large systems fail slowly, then suddenly. Not because no one was watching, but because what they were watching didn't fit expectations. Storms don't need to look apocalyptic to be destabilizing. Climate doesn't need to collapse to strain civilization. Stress doesn't need to be global to cascade. It only needs to converge. And convergence is subtle. It looks like overlapping crises, compounding disruptions, temporary measures that become permanent. Adjustments layered on top of adjustments. From within the moment, it feels like adaptation. From outside, it looks like transition. This is why discussions about past cataclysms, resets, and global disruptions persist, not as prophecy, but as context. They remind us that stability is conditional, that equilibrium is dynamic, and that awareness often matters more than certainty. The question, then, is not whether extreme disruption will happen again. History guarantees that change will come. Twist. In forms we don't fully anticipate. The real question is simpler and more personal. How do we interpret the signals we're seeing right now? Do we view them as isolated noise, or as part of a broader pattern still taking shape? Do we trust that existing systems will adapt smoothly, or do we acknowledge that adaptation is rarely painless? And perhaps most importantly, does awareness change how we respond? What do you think? Are we better served by reassurance or by honest uncertainty? Share your perspective below, because the most important conversations aren't about predicting the future. They're about understanding the present, while there's still time to reflect on it. And whatever comes next, history shows that those who notice early tend to navigate change differently than those who don't. There's a reason discussions like this resurface during periods of uncertainty, not because people suddenly become irrational, but because instability heightens awareness. When systems function smoothly, few question their foundations. But when disruptions stack, even small ones, attention shifts from outcomes to causes. People begin asking broader questions, not what happened, but why does this keep happening? And more importantly, what assumptions are we making that might no longer hold? This is where long-term thinking becomes uncomfortable. Modern society is optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Redundancy is minimized. Buffers are reduced. Systems are interconnected for speed rather than insulation. That design works exceptionally well until conditions change. Then fragility becomes visible. This doesn't mean collapse is imminent, but it does mean that resilience is uneven. Some communities adapt quickly, others struggle. Some systems absorb stress, others amplify it. And during these periods, narratives compete. One narrative emphasizes reassurance, that disruptions are temporary, manageable, and isolated. Another emphasizes caution, that instability may be structural, cyclical, or compounding. Most people exist somewhere between those extremes. They don't expect catastrophe, but they don't fully trust permanence either. That middle ground is where reflection happens. It's where people quietly reassess priorities, where preparedness becomes personal rather than ideological, where curiosity replaces certainty. And this is often where the most important conversations begin. Not in headlines, not in official statements, but in private reflection. Looking at history not as a sequence of failures, but as a record of adaptation under pressure. Civilizations didn't survive past disruptions because they predicted them perfectly. They survived because some noticed patterns early, adjusted behavior, and remained flexible when assumptions broke down. That lesson applies regardless of scale. Whether change unfolds slowly or suddenly, awareness shapes response. So the question worth returning to isn't about belief, it's about orientation. Are we oriented toward permanence or toward adaptability? Do we assume stability will continue indefinitely? Or do we accept that conditions evolve, sometimes faster than expected? And when uncertainty appears, do we resist it or use it as an opportunity to think more clearly? What do you think? Does reflecting on past disruptions change how you interpret the present, even if you don't expect dramatic outcomes? Share your thoughts below. Because awareness doesn't require certainty. It only requires attention. And attention, historically, has been one of humanity's most valuable tools when navigating periods of transition. One of the most difficult challenges in any period of uncertainty is distinguishing between signal and noise. Modern life produces constant information, alerts, updates, expert opinions, counter-opinions. Everything competes for attention, and urgency is often mistaken for importance. In that environment, clarity becomes rare. Yet history suggests that clarity rarely comes from volume. It comes from patience, from stepping back far enough to see patterns instead of moments. When ancient societies recorded stories of storms, floods, and upheaval, they weren't documenting daily weather. They were marking thresholds, moments when conditions crossed from manageable to transformative. Those records survived because they mattered, not as predictions, but as memory. Memory of what happens when balance shifts. Science now gives us tools to measure what earlier cultures could only describe symbolically. We can track ocean circulation, atmospheric behavior, solar interaction, and long-term climate indicators with precision. But precision doesn't remove uncertainty. It refines it, and refinement reveals a truth that's often uncomfortable. Complex systems don't fail loudly. They drift, strain, and reorganize. From inside the moment, that reorganization feels like adaptation. From a distance, it looks like transition. This is why discussions around preparedness, resilience, and awareness don't belong exclusively to institutions or experts. They belong to individuals, because individuals experience change before narratives catch up. How people interpret signals influences how societies respond. Dismissal delays adjustment. Panic accelerates instability. Awareness sits between those extremes. It allows space for reflection without fear. And reflection changes behavior, not dramatically, quietly. It changes how people plan, how they prioritize, how they evaluate risk, how they think about continuity. None of that requires belief in catastrophe. It requires acceptance of uncertainty. So perhaps the most useful takeaway from this discussion isn't about storms or cycles at all. It's about mindset. Do we assume stability as a given? Or do we treat it as something to be maintained? Do we rely entirely on assurances? Or do we remain attentive to signals that don't fit expectations? And when history, science, and observation intersect, do we look away or lean in long enough to consider what they might be telling us? What do you think? Does reflection itself act as a form of preparedness? Share your perspective below. Because long before change becomes undeniable, it becomes noticeable. And noticing, calmly, clearly, without certainty, has always been the first step toward navigating whatever comes next. As this discussion comes to a pause, it's worth remembering something simple. History doesn't move in straight lines. It moves through cycles of stability and disruption, certainty and doubt, confidence and re-evaluation. Every era believes it understands the world it inhabits, until new information forces perspective to shift. That doesn't mean previous generations were wrong. It means they were human. They worked with the information available to them, just as we do now. They trusted systems that had functioned for decades, sometimes centuries. And when those systems changed faster than expected, recognition lagged behind reality. That lag is not failure. It's a feature of complex societies. What matters is how individuals respond once awareness begins to form. Not with fear, not with certainty, but with attention. Attention to patterns instead of headlines. Attention to history instead of assumption. Attention to uncertainty instead of denial. This isn't about predicting what comes next. It's about understanding how change tends to arrive, quietly, unevenly, and often disguised as normality. Storms don't announce significance. Shifts don't come labeled. Transitions rarely feel historic while they're happening. Only later do they receive names. So perhaps the most valuable takeaway isn't an answer, but a question to carry forward. When familiar systems feel slightly less stable. When explanations feel incomplete. When patterns begin to echo across time. How do you interpret that moment? Do you wait for clarity? Or do you remain observant while uncertainty remains? What do you think? Share your thoughts below. Because history shows that those who notice change early don't always control outcomes, but they often navigate them with greater clarity. And whatever the future holds, clarity has always been one of the most valuable tools we have.